Hi, everyone. A very good afternoon to you, and greetings from Nabit, India, on the day of independence. It's such a great pleasure, and it's an honor to have a person who has been working in the space of improving accessibility and reducing dependence of the differently abled over a huge period of time, plus the decades contribution that he has built. I have the proud privilege today, on the August occasion of the Independence Day, to host Mr. Amar Jain, who has been an advocate for accessibility and has been working in the space of digital accessibility apart from also being a distinguished corporate lawyer. Uh, Amar, it's such a pleasure welcoming you today.
Thank you so much, Arjun. And I think it couldn't be a better day to have this conversation because we're talking of independence and today's Indians' 76th Independence Day. So definitely a promising, look forward to a promising conversation today.
Absolutely, and the pleasure is mine to host you. Amar, before we start into the subject for the day, wherein we are speaking about the legalities and the laws which govern digital accessibility in India,
Sure.
a little more about your story and how have you moved away from, you're also a corporate lawyer, beg your pardon, but you have also moved into the new area of web accessibility expertise. And
Sure.
how do you manage such diverse roles? How have you been working in the space over the years? A small introduction for the audience today.
Sure. So, if I tell you very briefly about my personal life, I grew up in Jodhpur, Rajasthan. I studied in a Hindi medium blind school till
Okay.
12th. Then I moved to college. I did my law
Okay.
5 years from Government Law College, Mumbai. And I started working into the corporate law firm space as banking and finance and capital markets lawyer. I worked for about 7 years in corporate law firms. And while I started working, what I realized was that
Acha.
majority of the applications that we use for either day-to-day
Okay.
activities or for your professional work or for independent living or any such thing were highly inaccessible. And
Right.
you grow up as that enthusiastic young
Acha.
adult who wants to change the world, who wants to make a difference. So as a routine habit, I used to write to the service providers and say that, hey, your app is
Right.
not accessible, and can you work with me to make it accessible? And thankfully, because of the profession that I was in or I am in, I was always
Okay.
given an audience, at least by the business always used to hear me, because obviously people want to avoid any legal disputes or any litigations,
Good.
especially on the name of disability, etc., because from a
Absolutely.
reputation perspective, it's a huge damage, right? So keeping that in mind,
Sure.
businesses used to hear me, they used to give me a meeting slot, we used to have conversations on a coffee, and often I used to get a response from developers saying that,
Hmm.
what you're saying is absolutely valid, but the work that we need to do to make it
Okay.
accessible is huge. And, we don't have that bandwidth or the resources to
Okay.
be able to do it. And ultimately, look for a business, ultimately, what matters is return on investment. So, unless I can say that the
Absolutely.
85% population that you're focusing on right now is giving you lesser return than the
Right.
15% of the population that can give you more, business is not going to prioritize me as a segment. So that really irked me. And then it so happened that I was paying the highest taxes. I was in the high bracket taxes when it comes to payment of income taxes, and I was not able to pay my own tax. And it really irked me as a citizen that I'm earning and I'm
Acha.
paying, but I don't have the independence to pay. So I reached out to the income tax department, and they said again same thing. Their vendor said we can't make it accessible. We don't have the technological expansion capabilities right now. So I started thinking, that I always get kicked like a football. Developer says I can't do it, business says I want to do it, but I don't have the resources or I don't have the ROI factor here. That prompted me to learn how accessibility works in its technical
Right.
terms. That prompted me to self learn what is web
Okay.
accessibility, how do you go about making it technically accessible. If I'm sitting with a developer, it doesn't make sense for me to say to a developer, hey, look, my software does not work with your application. He's not going to understand it. But if I say that your images do not have
Hmm.
alt text, buttons are not labeled, your links are not properly, it doesn't have a discernible text, it makes a lot of sense to a developer because they feel that somebody is talking to them which belongs to the same community. And that made me enter into the
Right.
profession of web accessibility and continue from there on. So just to conclude here,
Okay.
as a result, we made
So
that
that has been your journey, and
yes. So we made that income tax application accessible. I gave a demo to the income tax team, and that's how we started working on making the entire e-taxation or income tax system accessible back then. So that was my first step into the web accessibility profession.
if I may ask you, which year was this when you worked on the accessibility for the income tax?
It was roughly around 2013 or 2014.
Acha. So that's a huge, contribution because eventually, as you rightly said, I fall in the high tax category, but I'm denied to pay my taxes myself. I think
Yeah.
that was a huge, barrier, which was not just faced by Amar, but many like him. And I think kudos to your work that now, as you mentioned, that it is accessible, and now that people with with vision disability or with speech and hearing disability can go ahead and work independently. And I think that's something which resonates with the day spirit about how can we build independence, and not dependence on any external person, member, or technology to assess.
Absolutely.
Which leads me to the next question, Amar. I also read about how you have helped banks make their ATMs accessible. Um, and this has been a path-breaking contribution. Can you tell me a little bit about what was the challenge and how you worked around it?
Sure. So what used to happen, Arjun, back then was that as person with blindness, again it was a depending factor where I had to seek help of somebody to be able to go to ATM, and then after inserting the card I didn't know what's
Hmm.
happening on the screen, right? Including entering my pin number, etc.
Right.
Everything was a mystery because the
Right.
screen based instructions were not communicated in an accessible format. It was always display, which I could not see.
Hmm.
So that prompted me.
Okay.
Of course, there were standards to make ATMs accessible. Uh, Indian Banks Association, which is a member voluntary self-regulatory organization, which came out with standards to make it accessible. But hardly banks were complying, and even today the compliance is quite sad for talking ATMs though. So I wrote to my bank saying that hey, there is this standard, and why don't we make our ATMs accessible so that even people like me can pay, can withdraw money, or can do all the transactions which other people do at the ATM. Obviously, the response was, we don't have the infrastructure. We don't. We have noted your feedback for improvement, etc. The typical diplomatic response that you get, right? It again irked me, and I was like, no,
Correct.
yeah, this can't
Hmm.
happen. I should be able to withdraw my money independently. And of course, you're dealing in huge transactions, so you can't get reliable assistance, and that should not how life should not be dictated on terms of others,
Right.
right? We gratefully appreciate and acknowledge the contribution of others and their help, but your life can't run
Hmm.
purely on basis of that. So again, I reached out to RBI, and then through that kind of worked with few banks to make sure that the talking ATM facility or the ATMs actually are made accessible, so that the each step flow of going, inserting the card, entering the PIN number, selecting the account type, entering the amount for withdrawal, etc., and finally the transaction confirmation. Each step of it is conveyed in an accessible format to all persons with disabilities. So that's how this journey started, and few banks implemented basis my
And
advocacy effort there.
so, was this limited only to the public sector banks, or was it also extended to the private sectors? What is the progress which has been made, Amar, if I may ask?
See, my of course the efforts which I did was with private sector banks, uh, but sadly the talking
Okay.
ATM or the accessible ATMs compliance right now is very very dismal. Uh,
Hmm.
Barring one public sector bank,
Okay.
majority of
Okay.
the other banks do not have talking ATM infrastructure in place.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So there is still a long runway ahead. It's not that it
Absolutely.
is absolutely at the place where it should be, as I
No, it
understand.
is.
And
Absolutely. Absolutely.
it embarrasses me to say that we are growing into one of the biggest global economic powers, and at the same time, we have a huge segment who do not have their financial freedoms at their own control. And
Yeah.
I can see that it's a very embarrassing situation which we are in. Um, to the next question, Amar, I have also, huge contributions you have made in the space of making judicial rights and financial rights available to the end beneficiaries. More from
Absolutely.
the financial part, of course, I'm interested, but uh, inaccessibility of one's fundamental judicial rights is something which I feel is a huge uh, segment which is not spoken very openly about and which should be more pronounced. And
Right.
for the viewers today, if you can speak about how you have worked in this space, because there is a huge beneficiary count of people with speech and hearing impairment and even with visual impairment who are also a part of the audience of our podcast, and
Sure.
they would look forward to hear from you on how you work in this space.
So let me take up these two issues separately, Arjun, just to answer this question. You see,
Sure.
financial rights are very, very essential to your dignified survival, right? If you are earning and if
Correct.
you're able to avail financial facilities, including that of a credit card or a housing loan, etc., it kind of puts you into a different footing versus you depending on others to be the main applicant for you and get a loan sanctioned on their credentials for you, or guarantee as a third party that
Hmm.
whatever you are undertaking today will be paid by you, and in case of default they will pitch in. That kind of puts you back in the economy,
Hmm.
and I again did not want this to happen. So again, when I was fully eligible to buy a home and I wanted to buy a home in Bombay, and one of the premier housing finance institutions said that we can't give loans to blind people, so why don't you get somebody as the main applicant and you be the co-applicant, although we'll
Hmm.
sanction the loan on your credentials, but on paper somebody else will be the main applicant. I said, why? Because when I am the bread earner here, when I am able to repay my loans, why should I not be the main applicant? That again kind of pushed me into looking at inclusion of financial rights for people with disabilities into multiple places, whether it is housing finance, whether it is loans, whether it is credit cards, whether it is demat and trading. All those aspects I worked with different regulators to make sure that we are able to cover up properly, and people with disabilities are given their due fundamental rights when it comes to financial independence. Now, talking about the judicial rights and its accessibility, you know, one of the very important learnings of my life has been that while we can be very good at policy, we can very well draft a policy, we can very well, make sure that people with disabilities are included in policy components. But the implementation is where the key
Right.
challenge remains. Because implementation depends on multiple stakeholders, how they think, how they perceive. And if your monitoring mechanism does not have accessibility embedded or means to make sure that you are able to exercise your rights or implement the policies which are pending for implementation, then the entire exercise is futile in my view. Which is why I feel judicial accessibility is as crucial as
Hmm.
any other rights that people with disabilities or anybody for that matter has. If a speech and hearing impaired person goes to a court and cannot avail sign language interpretation, then it's a denial of justice to him, right, or her. If a blind person goes to a court and
Absolutely.
the other party's responses or the other lawyer's responses are not accessible to him or her, then again it's a denial of justice. So, which is why we started working with the courts. We started with Supreme Court, and
Very true.
I'm glad to say that the current Chief Justice of India is very, very supportive when it comes to disability inclusion at courts. We started with district courts, we started with Supreme Courts. We are now slowly writing to each high court to adopt a policy and make a framework so that accessibility becomes part of the system. And it should not happen that I should be asked to run post to pillar to seek a particular accessibility or any reasonable accommodation that as a person with disability, you know, some things are If I can't see, then obviously there are things that we need to do alternatively, right? And these are the things which you should not be even asking
Right.
to become a policy, or become a judgment, or become somebody's order. These are something which we should recognize as a human being, that if somebody has a different need, then we should be able to account for it. But to get into that stage, I think we need to push these reforms through the systemic changes that we want to bring in. So, which is why we started working in that space.
Absolutely. No, it all starts. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it all starts with a new beginning. And hear from you that there has been immense progress which has already been made. That could be through a combination of advocacy. That could be a combination of you perhaps pursuing with the right people, and also good people at the helm who are making those decisions, as you mentioned about the Chief Justice. And we
Absolutely.
absolutely have complete trust, and we owe our gratitude for their concern towards our special friends. Proceeding from there, Amar, you have now for the most interesting part of this conversation. I have heard about how you have, pursued leading companies without naming them to make their websites accessible, and how they have also been at times which you have denied when they have denied or they have been slow in responding, and then you have persuaded them with a combination of a stick and a treat policy,
Yes.
to ensure that they make their websites accessible. But often, I believe that advocacy alone cannot help. There is, at times, the stick becomes equally important. You cannot
Absolutely.
always be because you cannot always be good with words. Of course, you have to be patient for change to happen, but beyond a point,
Yes.
you have to adopt the fear of law in the right people. So, can you tell me
Yes.
more about a few incidents and how you have been able to? Because I still feel that uh, people are well intended, but that's not
Yes.
the norm. There are some who intentionally are avoiding to get their uh, assets accessible. May that be their website, may that be the application, and so on and so forth. And what has been the procedures? Also, there's a myth in the industry that accessibility is a good to have, but not a necessity. If you could
Sure.
address this also, basis the laws and acts which are in place today.
Sure.
Over to you.
So, very, very good question, a very, very important question. If you see, Arjun, for most of the industry players, as I said, one of the very important aspect for any business is the ROI, the return on investment that they're going to generate, right? And often people believe that investing on accessibility is not going to fetch them return, which of course case studies have proven wrong. There are companies which invested in accessibility, and they have seen significant uptick in their business. But that's one problem. The second problem, as you rightly hit, is that businesses or companies feel that accessibility is something that we are doing as a social goodwill measure, and we are not obliged to do this, which of course has changed.
Right.
So I'll give you, I mean, because I've seen this pre-law and post-law, so I can give you that kind of experience and realization. Initially, when I used to write
Yeah.
to companies for accessibility, it used to be a very, very long drawn battle. It used to be a very, very long drawn process. Sometimes you did get responses. Sometimes those responses were very, very diplomatic. Sometimes those responses were very, very, uh, flat on the face. People saying, "Sorry, we don't have time for this right now," or "We don't consider this as very important
Yeah.
aspect." Or sometimes you did not even get responses. And I'm talking of the people who are in position of leadership, who are driving businesses,
Okay.
all the top names of the industry that you can name, any industry. I obviously don't want to name any specific player, but and it used to frustrate me because I am equally growing as an adult, and I have equally same needs as anybody else, whether it is the ability to watch a movie, or ability to go and to be able to date online, or to be able to shop online, or to do anything else that you and I do, or to go to, let's say, go to bar stock exchange and have couple of beers or drinks, and to be able to order myself. without depending on others. But when accessibility does not become a priority, it makes you feel dependent. And I wanted to kind of remove that from my life to the extent I could, and obviously remove from the life of others as well. So one of the things we did very
Mhm.
categorically is in 2016 Act of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is Indian law, which governs the persons with disabilities. We made sure that accessibility becomes an obligation under on each service provider, whether it is government or private. So each service provider, if you have, even if a single company which is more than 20 employees, you need to make your applications, you need to make your websites, everything accessible. And the deadline for that has already passed.
Okay.
The deadline was June 14, 2019. But despite that, the problem was
Okay.
that when you write to the companies and you ask them to make it accessible, people still try to delay that or say we have noted, we'll implement in due course, etc. And that due course does not come. So you have to keep pushing. So my strategy was very simple. You write to the founders. If you get a decent response in couple of emails or couple of follow-ups, good enough. If you don't get a response, send them a legal notice. 99% by the time
Okay.
you reach the legal notice stage, people will come to you for at least talking on the table. That what's the problem, how do we resolve this, or what is it that we can do. That is
Okay.
where it opens doors for communication, and it opens doors for you to get into their system, to make them feel that you can trust on your, they can trust on your advice. And that's when they are kind of persuaded to make it accessible. One of the things also I realized is that when people see it live, the impact that inaccessibility is making on the life of other person, then people realize it better
Mm.
than just emailing or talking about accessibility. When you see that, if you have steps in your flat or in your building, and if your parents can't get into it because they recently got fractured or something like that,
Exactly.
that's when you feel the need to have ramps, right? That's when you feel the need to have wheelchair accessibility. So that kind of sensitization becomes important. But there are companies and businesses, again, who don't bother about legal non-compliance, and because the penalties are not huge, the maximum penalty is 5 lakhs. That's where you use the
Right.
carrot and stick approach, right? That's where you take them
Okay.
legally, you take them to court, you make them realize that the reputational damage of not doing something for persons with disabilities is much, much wider
Mm.
than the financial implication. That is where
Mm.
your social media, or people like you who spread the message in the right to the
Mm.
right audience and in the right way becomes very, very important. That's when companies realize that this is not something, and especially after private equity investors coming in, for them ESG and all of that is very, very huge. And
Mm.
there are, I know of private investors who don't even invest if your company is non-compliant with those kind of norms. And if they see that a business is getting flagged for non-compliance with disability law, or is not catering to persons with disabilities, it definitely sets a very, very negative example and negative trend. So just to safeguard their reputation from that perspective, then you need to take that legal approach and get businesses to respond.
Okay. No. So yeah, this is very important. But you know, help me understand this. If today, as a private sector, somebody questions that you as the government are pressurizing or you adopting the stick, can
Hmm.
the government, in all honesty, claim that all its websites are accessible to the expected standards? And or does it make a situation that that my hands are dirty but I'm pointing towards or asking for a uh, cleaner handshake from the partner who's the private sector? So what is the status of the digital assets of various sectors of the government, which may be a B2C leaning from an accessibility standpoint?
See, Arjun, this answers the answer to this question has to be very nuanced. You need to understand the chain from where it starts. First thing, very
Okay.
important, recognition of the right that you as a person will deserve accessibility as a person with disability. So that we sorted out through the legal framework, right? That problem we sorted out. The second problem is
Okay.
the awareness in the industry to build accessible infrastructure. If you, I'll give you very simple and connectable, relatable examples. People all understand that we need ramps for people with wheelchair, right? But if you look at the design of the ramps, if you look at so many ramps that are built in, they are so steep that the minute you put the wheelchair on the ramp, person is likely to fall. Because from
Hmm.
an accessibility perspective, yes, you complied with the requirement to give a ramp, but you did not know how to implement
Hmm.
it. The awareness is lacking. This is the same problem with the government is designing
Hmm.
websites. They do give accessibility as one of the component of their scoping exercise to the vendor, that okay, make it accessible, etc. The poor people implementing the website design do not know about accessibility.
Hmm.
The people who or the vendors who are involved or impaneled to do audits don't know about accessibility. So the implementation part of it becomes very, very patchy. They'll just give you few skip to main content link or few other items like ability to be able to change color contrast or themes, etc. Even then, the main content or the website or the application remains inaccessible because the implementation gaps are huge. One of the critical aspect that is missing from government sector right now is that while they are trying to make their websites accessible or applications accessible, but the user feedback is not accounted for. You can design something 100% in compliance with accessibility standards, but it can be a terrible experience as a user because you did not consider that aspect in mind while designing for accessibility. So that key part is missing. But as I said, policy and having that right is very, very important to be able to see. Otherwise, what happens if I don't have a right to accessibility? I'll literally go as a beggar and asking for a accessibility because I want it. But if I have the right, people will have to take it in a dignified way and dignified approach. And that's very important. And it's unfair to say that if X person is violating the law, then even I will violate the law. Statutory compliance is not dependent on what the other side is doing. It is in your interest to ensure that your business or your company or your offering remains legally as compliant as it can get, rather than looking what your next door neighbor is doing, right? Because you don't want bad reputation, you don't want legal disputes on your business for something which as a human being you should have catered to. When we care for our plants environment because we need to safeguard that, why can't we cater to living beings who are persons with disabilities and whose life get affected because of something that we design which is inaccessible?
It's basically going to make uh, life simpler uh, if adopted for your customers, which would eventually help build not only a even playing space wherein it's inclusive, it would also help deliver greater business. Is what companies should remember, and perhaps that is what it should be thought to be achieved. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, it's a very small cost to make yourself accessible, and it is going to be rewarded multiple times uh, with the business volumes which would come with it. With that note, and wishing you and the audience for the show today again a very happy and happy Independence Day and a very prosperous year ahead. May the country prosper. May we have more opportunities for employment for our persons with disabilities, and may we, as a starting point, have a more inclusive digital workplace and a more digital inclusive internet. With that hope, and much as I would want to continue this conversation, but unfortunately, with the paucity of time, I would want to thank Amar for sparing your time today and educating us about the facets of accessibility and the legal aspects of it. It's such a pleasure having you, Amar, and look forward for more interactions going forward. Thank you so much for your time.